Welcome to the Business and Society podcast. I'm your host, Senthil. What does it mean to live a full life, not just a successful one? My guest today has spent a lifetime wrestling with that question, and the answers have taken him from the boardrooms of Procter & Gamble to the pages of some of India's most celebrated books. Gurcharan is a former CEO, a best-selling author, and one of India's most distinctive public intellectuals. His memoir, Another Sort of Freedom, traces his life through the classical Indian framework of the four aims, Dharma, Artha, Kama, and Moksha, not as a tidy philosophy, but as a lived and honest reckoning with what he sought and what it cost him. We talk about the moment he was fired on his first day in business and rehired the next morning, about running P&G India under the license Raj and the ethical tightrope that came with it, and about the idea at the heart of Bhagavad Gita that he believes is one of the greatest gifts to modern leadership. Gurcharan, thank you so much for joining me today.
Nice to be here.
Well, let's talk about your memoir. Your memoir traces your life through four stages: Dharma, Artha, Kama, and Moksha. I wanted to ask you, how consciously were you living those stages at that time versus making sense of them in retrospect?
Well, I certainly was not conscious of it when I was living it, but it was really, in retrospect, it's a realization that really all human beings go through this particular framework, like classical Indian framework of their lives. And I think of them actually as potentialities. You know, Dharma is moral well-being, Artha is material well-being, Kama is emotional, sexual well-being, and Moksha, if you will, is spiritual well-being. But it doesn't have to be a transcendental spiritual. It can be a this worldly spiritual as well. So my point is that I was not conscious of it, but in hindsight, I think of these as capabilities that all human beings have. So this is a bit of an Aristotelian spin on the idea. And frankly, I feel that if one fulfills one's capabilities, one has lived a flourishing life. And so it's a good way to think about one's life, that there is, what I like about it also is that unlike religions, that there is no overwhelming one goal in life. Aristotle was very sensible in positing multiple goals of life. And that's how we human beings are.
I was really surprised when I was reading the book how honest you were in reflecting some of your experiences. I mean, as you rightly mentioned in your book, it's a memoir. It's not a biography that captures your entire life's journey. But even there, I saw a bravery in you that you have not hesitated to put forth to the world all the experiences. Is it something you've always had, or because you are at a stage in life you thought you should be honest about these things?
Well, it's got the good and the bad. And frankly, the reader is careful. To build the reader's trust, you should be honest. In the sense that if you fill it up with all the good sides and the good stories about you, then the reader will say, my God, what a narcissist. Why do you have to read him? And pompous ass. On the other hand, if you try and give only the bad news to the reader will say, what a loser. Why should I read him? So it's best to be yourself. And also, you're absolutely right that a memoir is an opportunity to get to know oneself. Because in our lives, we do many things and we forget many things. And there are significant moments, there are dots in your life. And the job of a memoir is actually to try and connect the dots and to find some kind of pattern. And if you're lucky, one day you do find it and you say, aha, So that's who I am.
And going back to the dots analogy you talked about, I mean, as a reader, the way I connected your dots is how your mother called you, a restless child. If you look at your career trajectory, it's very hard to predict, if you get my point. You reached the pinnacle of a company, then suddenly you decided you'll go and write, and it's not an easy topic. So you write about Indian philosophy, you write about Aristotle, you write about what you learned from John Rawls. I mean, were you always like this, or you're like the Forrest Gump movie character that, life throws something at you and you get excited and decide to move from there?
You refer to my mother's description of me as a restless child. And the fact is that restlessness has been one of the features of my life. And it was really early on that I was introduced by my parents who had two different expectations of me. This was when I was coming home one day from kindergarten, carrying a report card in my hand, smiling away. And my mother was waiting at the door of the house. I'm 4.5 years old. We are in Lahore. And my mother asks, "Did you stand first?" My father was standing nearby and he told her that was the wrong question. Ask him what he likes to do in school. Ask him, does he like to draw? Does he like stories? Who are his friends? And I think early on, that dichotomy was born, and I lived all my life with my mother, who had the good Punjabi middle class woman's mother's anxieties about me making a living one day, and my father, more relaxed, who also said that he wanted me to make a life. And so this making a living versus making a life is what's carried me through.
So you were searching for jobs, went to Mumbai, selling Vicks Vapor, but you got fired on day one. How was it like?
Yeah, that was horrible. I had no clue what business was all about. And I still thought of the world in terms of a seminar room in the ivy-covered halls at Harvard. And so you were encouraged to ask questions. And so here I was, 20 years old. And so the first thing was that we all got tea. It was a small company, the company that made Vicks Vapor Rub. That's the company I joined. And it hasn't grown yet. I came actually very early on in the company. And there were maybe a couple of dozen people in the whole company. And we were near the Flora Fountain in Bombay. We had an office on the third floor of this building. And uh, the person, the peon in the office, brought tea. But he brought tea to those who were officer grade in a tray with biscuits, and to the staff, the secretaries, the receptionists, and others, he gave them in a cup, in a saucer, in a cup, And so the boss, who was the sales manager, under whom I was put as a trainee when I joined, he came to us, and we were three of us who were trainees. The other two stood up, and I forgot to stand up. But nevertheless, he greeted us, and then he said, "Do you have any questions?" So one question was, "How come we get tea in a tray and the others get tea without a tray?" And he thought that was an odd question to ask and didn't deserve a reply. So he kind of looked at me and looked into my eyes as though I was a bit deranged or something. And he dismissed it as silly boy. Yeah. And then something similar happened. There was a few days later, I don't know, the same afternoon, they had a training session. And he was not supposed to be there for this training session for the salespeople in the Western region. And so we trainees were asked to help out in that training session. And then he arrives in the middle of it and says to the trainees, now listen, let me give you advice. All of you, you have each a route to cover from shop to shop, etc., town to town. So first of all, you'll be traveling by train, and I would suggest, he says, then you'll go and meet the stockist of the town, the distributor. And so I would suggest you memorize his first name and his second name, and also memorize his phone number, because you may need it in an emergency. And then he said, well, you should also memorize the timetable when your train leaves, so you don't forget. And so you have each of you 5 or 10 towns. So that's just memorizing the timetable of the railway, of the train. So again, I asked him a question. I said, we can look it up. Why memorize it? We can look up the phone number of the stockist. I agree. It's good to know his name. But why do we have to memorize the timetable or his phone number? Again, the guy he was being questioned, and I had forgotten that this is a hierarchical business organization. Anyway, he goes to the top boss and tells the managing director, look, I think we've got a rotten idea. And the fellow says, why? But he says he asks too many questions, and they're silly questions. He doesn't know that in business, you have to follow orders. And so he says that, look, before it's too late, let's let him go. So by the end of the day, I was told that thank you. I was given a ticket to go back home, and so this was all happening at the end, and I had left certain things at the office. So the next day I came to pick up in order to catch my train to go home. And I was immediately called by the secretary of the managing director, and she took me in, and the managing director asked me what had happened. He was saying goodbye to me and said what had happened. So I explained. And then the guy said, I'm sorry, but we want you to stay. And there's been a mistake. It's our fault. And so don't think of it. The ticket you have, give it to me. We'll get a refund of the ticket, and you stay on. So that's the story.
What a story.
Fired and rehired within 24 hours.
And the same qualities, you said, questioning people, which may not be looked at kindly. You became the CEO of Procter & Gamble India. Of course, the company acquired Wix. Not just any CEO, but for people from my generation, you are more than a role model. What qualities made you to reach those positions? How did you navigate that?
Well, I suppose one quality was that curiosity, but asking questions, things that were obvious. That was that restlessness that my mother had pointed out when I was 6 months old and wrote down in a diary. I haven't really thought about this very well, but the other was something that, that if you had to do a job, you might as well do it well. I mean, Maybe this is what my mother had given me. I don't know. My father had encouraged me to be relaxed about life. She had given me more ambition. Because you do need ambition, and and but I would just say that instead of thinking about myself, there was a guy I observed in our company who came in as a, and maybe if we have a minute or two, I can talk about him and what qualities he had that I admired and why he made good. And this is a guy who came to our company. By that time, I had become the head of the Indian operation. He came in from a village in Maharashtra, and this was first time a villager coming to Bombay, loved the lights of the city, very excited. And he came in as the evening guard, the security guard in the company. He didn't know much English, and he was a villager, but he was hungry. And second quality that he had was, again, a curiosity about the big city, and any gadget he found, he got very excited. Like the first day he discovers the coffee making machine. And so he's immediately testing how it works. And then he makes some coffee and serves it to all of us as a test. And then the next day he discovers the telex machine. Those days we sent telexes to each other. And he didn't know English, so he couldn't send a telex. But he made himself learn English. He actually did because he was a night guard, he's a night shift. Daytime, he would normally should have been sleeping, but he also took English lessons on his own. And so he did that. But I think the quality that defined him was that he loved his work. I think he would have paid us to come to work. So we kept trying him in different positions in the company. And he kept rising up and up. And he rose up to being a director of the company one day. Now, that's what I meant by somebody who, now to me, the key attribute is the attribute that the advice that Krishna gives to Arjun in the Gita, in the Bhagavad Gita, which is the notion of Nishkam Karma. Do the action for the sake of the action and not for your personal reward. And so if you can act in a way that you don't care who gets the credit, mind you, it's not easy to behave that way. But I feel that quality is what leads ultimately to success in any endeavor. And to me, that is the most original idea in the Bhagavad Gita. And it's very important gift to modern management.
Yeah. And you ran P&G India at the height of license Raj, and you wrote extensively about it. I wanted to ask you, how did you balance the ethical dilemmas versus delivering performance? And license Raj was always about, like greasing the wheels, whatnot. So that's a very complex landscape to operate. How did you navigate that?
Until one year we had a flu in the country and we sold a hell of a lot of Vicks. It was a pandemic and we kept the stocks of the pharmacies and the chemist shops. We ran 3 shifts and we thought we did a good job. But at the end of the year, I got a summons from the government saying that we had broken the law. And the law that we had broken was the law of licensing. We had a license to make only so many tons of Vicks. And to break the law, there was a 2-year jail sentence. Now, it was at the discretion of the government, but they could impose that on you. And so I was summoned to Delhi and I was asked to explain what had happened. And so I arrived with two junior lawyers with me, and we are made to wait a couple of hours outside the office of the Joint Secretary. And then we are led in, and the Joint Secretary is reading the Times of India that day, and we sit down, and we are too polite to go like that to remind him that we are waiting. But eventually puts the paper down, and he says, "Kya?" Meaning what? And I said, "Sir, you've summoned us. You've summoned me. You tell me what."
Mm.
And so he says, "You broke the law." And I said, "Well, there was a flu, and we thought we'd done good. In the flu, we helped millions of families, children, and everybody." Uh, and he says, "But you broke the law." And I said, "Yes, but." He said, "No, yes or no." And I said, "Yes, we broke the law." And he writes down loudly saying, he confesses that he broke the law. And then he says to us, "Well, look, the fact is that you chaps in the private sector are always finding shortcuts, and especially you multinational companies are here exploiting us. You remember the East India Company," he says, and so I want to make your company as an example. I want to make
Mm.
an example of your company. And so now the law will take its course." And he says, "Go." And so as I'm leaving his office, I turn around, at the door of his office, and I say, "Sir, we are a multinational company, and it isn't every day that executive of multinational goes to jail. And the news will appear in all the papers, New York Times, or since we are an American company, it will appear in the American papers, but also other places in the world, including the Times of India that you're reading." And I said, "What do you think a reader who will read the paper will say when he reads that here was a company that was doing good, and you, as a consequence, rewarded it by sending the head to jail?" And he said, "Are you threatening me?" And I said, "No, this is what I'm just telling you. This is what will happen." And what do you think the world will think of India's laws, India's leaders, our prime minister, persons like you? What will they think of us when they read this? And he said, "Out you go." He sent me out. Well, I had sleepless nights. The lawyers told me as we came out, you should have gotten on your knees and begged for mercy. And look at
Mm.
you threatening the man. You're the one who broke the law. And anyway, after a few weeks, we learned that the government had dropped the inquiry completely. Somebody must have seen sense in all this. But that very week, went and joined the Swatantra Party, and I reread my Hayek, and I read Adam Smith again, and I had, like everybody, I was a socialist and was always voted for the Congress Party, and after that, I never voted for the Congress Party, and so that was the personal change that this mad incident brought out. But it also tells you that here we were a country, a proud democracy, and we were a fully liberal democracy with universal franchise. And we had a lot, we could thank Mr. Nehru for a lot, because he embedded institutions of democracy. But he had no clue about running the economy. And he was a old-fashioned socialist. And the only model available was the Soviet model. And he ended up doing was giving, instead of socialism, we got statism, which we call license Raj. And as a result, we betrayed the hopes of 2 generations of young people because it was all done in the name of the poor. And when you look at the statistics between 1950 and 1990, we hardly made a dent on poverty. Indira Gandhi got into power because of Garibi Hatao, remove poverty. And oddly enough, I don't blame Nehru because he was a creature of his age. But I do blame Indira Gandhi because by then, the Asian tigers had risen. And the global institutions like the World Bank, IMF, would remind India to look east. Look at how these countries were growing rather than the socialist model that we had adopted.
You tried to get into politics, but it seems you haven't got a warm welcome. You met some of the top leaders of political parties. Tell us about that journey.
Well, so I quit the corporate world at 50. And the reason I quit Central was, I was at the top of my career. But one day we were having a meeting on Pampers. Pampers is a product, baby diapers that Procter & Gamble makes. By then, I was the global head of strategy at the headquarters of Procter & Gamble in America. And so we are having these presentations from different countries, different geographies, R&D people about plans for the following year. And I'm looking out the window and I'm saying to myself, is this what life is all about? Selling an extra case of Pampers or Vicks or all these good products that the company makes? But surely there's more to life than that. And that's really when, and of course, the trigger, if you've read my memoir, Another Sort of Freedom, the trigger really was going to work and turning on the radio to NPR, where there's news coming that the reforms in India were in trouble. 1991 really was the year when I thought really got our freedom. Not in 1947, but in
1991.
And so for me, the year is 94, end of 93, 94. And when I hear that the reforms are in trouble and the Congress party, the left wing of the Congress party has reasserted itself, and it's saying that the reforms were a sellout to capitalism and the world, or to the West. I got very worried, and because I knew Mr. Dr. Manmohan Singh, who was then finance minister, but I had known him when he was a nobody. And so I kept his email with me. Anyway, I shot him a message saying that, look, I'm very worried. Nobody's defending the reforms. Why? Why not? And so on. And I didn't expect him to get any reply after the finance minister. But oddly enough, he replies and he says, you come back and sell the reforms to people. By then, I was also writing op-eds, and I had become a weekend writer anyway for many years. And so I told my wife, it's time to go home. And she says, you're not even 50. And the retirement age is 65. And who's going to give us a salary after this? And so she brought some reality check. But I had to sit down and explain to her our expenses, would they be, our investment. By then, I was at a pretty high place in the PNG hierarchy where you get a lot of money. And in the last 2-3 years that I've been working at headquarters, we had really got quite a lot, enough. I explained to her this was enough for the rest of our life. Because in India, we were not paid. Under license Raj, our salary was controlled by the government. And so she was a good sport. She agreed, and I came back. And I came back, but the last thing, when I was saying goodbye to my boss, who was the CEO of the company, and he said, look, if you're going to go back to write about the reforms, why don't you help in doing the reforms? Go into politics. Anyway, I came back, I followed Manmohan Singh, and I wrote some articles. Then I got a column in the Times of India every Sunday, twice a month. And then I brought out a book called India Unbound. And India Unbound was the first book that predicted the economic rise in India. And India opens obliged by rising also. And so, that's how I came back. But after a few years of writing, I remembered my boss's injunction that I should actually do the reforms. And so, because I had interviewed so many leaders of parties, etc., I decided I'd try the Congress party because that was the leading party. I said, no point getting into a party that's not going to come to power. And I said, I'll subvert it internally. So I got an appointment with Sonia Gandhi. I'm talking about when the Congress party was out of power. Vajpayee was the prime minister. So we're talking about 2001, 2002, something like that. So Sonia Gandhi was not in power. I visited her in her home. And I introduced myself, etc., etc. And she said, yeah, I know about your columns, etc. And as we were chatting, the newspaper was open, I think Hindustan Times or whatever, and the headline was that the Congress party is preventing the reforms in insurance. And in other words, they're not allowing foreign insurance companies to come in. That's what the government wanted to do, open to the foreign insurance companies, the Indian market. And so she said to me, now, how will this help the country? A poor farmer. How will opening insurance help the poor farmer? That's the one she says I'm concerned with. So I explained that there are special insurance policies for which insure the produce for a farmer. You could even, in fact, they could be forward contract made, and the farmer could have the benefit of this contract. And if the crop didn't come up, the insurance company would pay. Anyway, I think she quickly lost interest in what I was saying, and she became very quiet. And so, it's unnerving when somebody you're talking to suddenly becomes quiet. And so you keep talking to break the ice or it's an unpleasant experience to be sitting in silence to people for too long. And so I kept chatting away. And after a while, after about half and 40 minutes or so, she got up. And I got up and we said goodbye. And then a few weeks later, she called me back. But again, it was an odd experience. I thought I was talking to the air. And she had no interest in knowing about reforms or anything like that. And she was like a sphinx. Very odd. Anyway, I asked somebody in the Congress party who was responsible for organizing my interview, and asked him, I said, what had happened? And he said, you're too much of a reformer here. She's too much left of you. And he said that, I don't know, he said her father had been a union leader. So she was fundamentally anti-management or business. I didn't know any of that, but it was very odd. And so I thought I'd try my hand with the BJP. And I went to meet Mr. Advani. And Mr. Advani was a lot warmer and so on. And he appreciated what I was saying about reforms, asked me questions. He was much more conscious of what we were discussing. And then he asks me, and what do you think about Hindutva? Meaning the ideology of the BJP, which is the Hindu right, the notion that this is a Hindu nation. And I said, it's a terrible idea. And I said, look, there's a real opportunity to promise economic growth because the Congress party just has no clue. Their idea of economic growth is just giving freebies to the voter. And so he too lost interest in me once I said that it was a bad idea. And so that's my experience with real politics. And so I've ended up as a classical liberal in the middle. I can't vote for the Congress because they don't understand economics still. And they're still too far left of center. And I can't vote for the BJP because the BJP has this very toxic idea of a Hindu nation. I'm a secular, believes in keeping religion out of politics, especially our partition in India.
You have been a staunch supporter of economic liberalization. I wanted to ask you, 2 decades on from liberalization, has your view of what markets can deliver for society shifted? I understand that the India growth is amazing. It pulled millions out of poverty. But do you think that's equitable or there could be a better way?
Well, first of all, I think we've done well in many ways. We've had a growth rate of 6.4% over 30 years. Now, for a democracy, that's a real growth rate net of inflation. That is unprecedented almost. Not as good as China, but then China is not a democracy. We have lifted 450 million out of poverty. The middle class has gone from 10% to 30%. Again, not as well as China, where it's gone over 50%. This is good. We've created an IT revolution. We've become a player in the IT world. And in domestically, we've had a digital revolution where it's taken away a lot of the frictions, both in many, many ways. In government welfare measures, it's just the money goes directly into the bank account of the woman every month. So all that's good. But where we have failed is we seem to have skipped from a green revolution to a IT revolution, a knowledge revolution, and skipped the middle, which is the factory state. So we have not created an industrial revolution. So today, manufacturing employs less than 11% of the people. It's less than 15% of GDP. And export of manufacturers is only 2% of global exports of manufactured products. And there are a number of reasons for the fact that we failed. But to answer your question, so my report card, India is, by the way, still not unbound. I wrote India Unbound because what's prevented partly is that we did not remove the entire regulation mania of the license raj. India is today still the most over-regulated economy in the world. A company has to make 6,900 filings a year. And of those filings, a quarter or 20 to 25% have a jail sentence associated if you make a mistake or if you forget to do it. So we have the hangover of the license raj. None of our prime ministers has sold the reforms. The Congress party, Manmohan Singh or whoever, did not even sell it to their own party. They have not sold it to the bureaucracy. They've not sold it to the people. And people today still believe that the reforms make the rich richer and the poor poorer. They still think they cannot differentiate between being pro-market and pro-business. And worst of all, you have the situation where the bureaucracy, the great nation, the reforming nations, say China, which when they did the reforms in China, or Margaret Thatcher in the UK, Margaret Thatcher used to say, I spend 20% of the time reforming and 80% selling the reforms. And China, Deng Xiaoping changed the incentive system of the bureaucracy when they did the reforms in the late 70s. He said to the bureaucracy, we will measure you now by the investment you bring in. If you want to get promoted, we measure you by the jobs you create, whether you are a village in charge of the village or the district or the city. And that's why when I went to China and we had to put up a plant there, factory, the mayor of the city came to meet me at the airport. Now in India, this would never have happened. There's always been a suspicion of the private sector in India. So what I'm trying to say is that these are some of the things. But the good news is that we are today in a far better position to create that industrial risk. Despite the onslaught of AI, and AI will slow us down, but there's still a window of opportunity, say 15 years or so, 20 years for a demographic dividend, and 10 to 15 years where robotics will take over. So in this period, the fact is that we can still, if we do the reforms that we need to do, we can actually create that industrial revolution. We have far better infrastructure today in India than we did in 95. And we have, as I said, digital. So 90% of people have bank accounts before 40% did. And so this is the result of this. People haven't even seen the face of a bank. They have a bank account. And a lot of these things, good things have happened. But the fact is that the hard work is still required. And for a person who is in position of power at Mr. Modi, these are all doable. These are things that are doable. And the best example I can give is the Apple phone, the iPhone, which landed up in India as the China +1 location. And today, 30% of world's iPhones are being made in India in 1.5 to 2 years. That's all. And the iPhone factory employs 200,000 direct jobs, of which 70% are women in assembly, and 4 indirect jobs. Almost 800,000 jobs have been created. But and the way to do it, you know what? When the Prime Minister of Vietnam heard that they had lost the iPhone to India, he flew to Cupertino, California, met the CEO of Apple, and made a presentation, said that now can you give us the tablet, the iPad? And he got it. And when in India, when I asked a senior official in the government, how did we get the iPhone? He said, we gave them permission. Can you see the difference between the Chinese, the Vietnam behavior and our behavior? So we have to change our attitude. And I think there are some states that are aware of this. They know it, like Tamil Nadu, etc. They understand it. And that's how actually Tamil Nadu was able to open a factory for Ford, which had been lying in mothballs, became a factory only for export. Because Stalin went there, he's the chief minister, and he persuaded. So my point is, what if other chief ministers behaved in this way? You could do it. You could do it because we have a bigger market than Vietnam or others, domestic market. So we have a lot of positives going for us. And I'm optimistic. I feel that the government has realized they've created 3 deregulation commissions, empowered them. And we hope, I'm looking forward to the bonfire that they're going to create in these thousands of compliances that we have.
One final question before we wind up. So, your work has drawn deeply on Indian texts such as Mahabharata and Gita. What ideas from these books that are particularly relevant for leaders today in the business sphere?
Well, I would say one, we talked about the 4 aims of life, the 4 goals of life. And that's a kind of reassuring, practical, something that we've all experienced. And it gives a framework to live our life. And for those people who tell you there's only one way, and that is the way either to find God or to withdraw into the forest or whatever. And this is a very practical and a very reassuring way, particularly when you can think of them as capabilities, satisfying your capability. The second was, I mentioned Nishkam Karma from the Gita, which is the most original idea in the Gita, that act for the sake of the work that you do, but not worry too much about the personal consequences that will come from the work, and which is essentially a good idea, which is, try and shrink your ego a little bit so that you're always not looking for getting premium treatment all the time that we all of us seek. And so these 2 ideas I found in my own personal experience have been helpful to me.
Gurcharan, what an honor spending time with you today and listening to some of your stories. Thank you so much for taking your time and giving all these valuable perspectives from your own life.
Thank you, Senthil.
Gurcharan Das reminds us that the examined life and the active life don't have to be in opposition. He has lived both, with restlessness, with honesty, and with the refusal to settle for easy answers about what business, politics, or a good life are actually for. His memoir, Another Sort of Freedom, is available now. If this conversation moved you, I'd encourage you to pick it up. It reads the way he speaks, warmly, candidly, and with great depth. If you enjoyed this episode, please share and subscribe wherever you listen.